Hello. For this video, I'm going to demonstrate all of the watercolor techniques that I introduced in class. So before you get started, I would recommend that you gather and assemble all of your materials, and those should be available to you in a materials list. So if you're not sure where to find that, make sure you ask before you get started and get everything set up before you continue to follow along and paint. So the first thing that you're going to need is you're going to need a sheet of watercolor paper. I'm using a 6-inch by 6-inch square. You're going to want a surface to tape it to. That can be the table. I've got some scrap folders here. You'll want some masking tape. I've got both white 1/2-inch masking tape, and then I've got like the smaller green masking tape. So the first thing you will do before we get started on any of the techniques is you're going to want to tape all the way around all 4 corners of your paper, okay, which I've already done before. Tape that. And what this will do is this will give you kind of a clean border along the edge, but it'll also give your paper something to stick to so that as you paint, it'll make it less likely that the paper will wrinkle and buckle as you create your design. Now, the first technique that I'm going to explain and talk about is masking with tape techniques. With masking with tape, you use masking tape to tape out a design and then tape around it. So I'm just using that as the basis for the whole design that I'm making up on the paper. So when you are creating your design, if you're trying to create all of the techniques that I'm going to demonstrate, make sure you have at least 12 different shapes or sections on your paper. And I've just created an asymmetrically balanced design with the tape. So once your tape design is created and everything is securely attached to the paper, we're ready to begin. You're also going to need watercolor paints. You're going to want a cup with some water. Make sure you have a paintbrush and a towel for blotting your paintbrush on. And then you're also going to want to assemble the other materials that you'll need for the techniques. You will need rubbing alcohol, crayons, plastic wrap, table salt, and sponges, like a scrap sponge, and that should be about it. Okay, so once our tape design is done, the first thing I'm going to do is create an even wash. So to do an even wash, you are going to wet the paper. So just dip your paintbrush in the water and wet the area that you want to paint. And you just need to make the paper damp. It doesn't need to be like a puddle of water. Select a color that you want to use and you paint that in. Add the pigment and spread it out as evenly as possible. So it's called an even wash because number one, we're creating a wash. Anytime you make a wash, you wet the paper first and kind of paint and build up thin layers of paint. And then it's an even wash because you want a solid, even, consistent layer of pigment or color in the shape. So that's an even wash. The next technique I'm going to demonstrate is a graded wash. And I'm going to show you how to do 2 different graded washes. So again, because it is a wash, you're going to want to wet your paper so that it's damp. And the reason we wet the paper is because that allows the paint to spread out more easily. So when we wet the paper, your paint is going to spread, fade, and blend. And then select the color that you would like to use. And you're just going to put a stripe of that color or pigment all along one side. And because your paper is wet, it's automatically going to start to spread and blend. So that's an important piece of information to keep in mind as you work. Anytime you have wet paper and you paint with wet paint on wet paper, it is going to spread and blend and fade and bleed into other sections. So one thing you'll notice that I'm doing once I have added my pigment, whatever direction I want the pigment to blend. So for example, I want my color to blend from left to right. You're going to actually swish your paintbrush perpendicular to that. So I'm kind of going an up and down motion. I'm starting on the lightest side and I'm swishing up and down, back and forth, right up into the area that I painted. And the goal, ultimate goal that we're trying to do and achieve, is to get this to look like it gradually fades away from a bright color on one side all the way over to white on the other. So after I blend that and add that in, my color's going to lighten a little bit. It's not going to look so bright. So you're going to want to dip your paintbrush in the pigment. Don't add any water to it. Because the less water you have, the lighter or the brighter or darker your color will be. Okay, so just add that pigment in and start to pull that down, maybe about a halfway or third of the way down. I'm cleaning my brush out. I'm blotting out the excess water on my towel. And then I'm doing the same thing again. Just going to swish my brush kind of back and forth across the white paper and then pulling it into the pigment. So it's important to know, once you clean your brush out, I'm just going to add a tiny bit of water to my brush so that it'll blend better. But once you blot your brush is now going to pull up and absorb anything that you paint with. So keep that in mind as you're trying to blend. Okay. So a graded wash gradually fades or creates a gradation from one color to another. So in this case, we've done a gradation from white all the way to color. The second type of graded wash that I'm going to show you is where we create a gradation and gradually fade from one color to the next. So I'm going to start the exact same way that I did before. Wet the paper. And then I'm going to add my pigment. So I'm just going to dot that in. Let that spread and blend. Okay, so I'm going to go about maybe halfway, no further. And then pick a color that you want to blend opposite. Okay, it can be any color you want. I tend to try to avoid opposites on the color wheel, like red and green or purple and yellow, just because when they mix, they do happen to create kind of like a brown color in the middle, but you are welcome to experiment and mix and blend any colors you want. So I've chosen purple and orange. So again, I'm going to do one on one side, one on the other. And then once I've added those initial layers, I'm going to, so I've got a lot of excess water in the middle, so I'm just going to kind of suck that up with my paintbrush before I start to blend. So I'm just going to, once I dab all the water on my brush, and then continue to dab the paintbrush out, we're going to start to pull color from one side. Again, swishing my paintbrush, kind of perpendicular to the way you want that to go. So I move my brush up and down from one side and gradually pull and fade a color across. Clean my brush out, blot the water, and then do the same on the other with the orange. You start to get that to fade. Okay, and then again, don't forget, if your colors don't look as bright as you would like, go ahead and add a little bit of more paint with less water and start to fade those across. So a lot of it just takes a lot of practice. Okay, you just got to practice blending and mixing until you feel confident using the techniques. Okay. So getting the colors to blend smoothly and evenly is one of the more challenging techniques for most students historically. So if this is something that you are struggling with, so we don't want it just to kind of end with like a line here. Okay, make sure that you do try to get those to fade and blend smoothly from one color to another. So it takes practice, patience, and time. So I think we've got that where it kind of gradually fades from one to the next. So those are our graded washes. Okay, so we've got an even wash, a graded wash with one color to white, a graded wash with one color into another. Okay, this third technique I'm going to explain is a wet into wet. So because it's wet into wet, we start with wet paper. Okay. So a wet into wet is a little bit different than a wash because with a wash, we're interested in trying to create like a thin, even layer color. With a wet into wet, we're mainly just concerned with letting wet paint kind of spread out and blend into wet paper. So if you wanted, you could just use like a single color. You can kind of dot that in and then notice the way that it's going to spread out and blend, okay, and create interesting colors and effects on that. So with a wet and the wet, we're not necessarily concerned about fading it across evenly or covering the whole page as well. What we want to do with wet and the wet is just kind of mix and blend colors and see how, when they're wet, they will bleed into each other and kind of fade and mix. So I'm choosing all warm colors because I know warm colors will mix and blend well together. So I've got orange and red. Let's do a little bit more yellow. Kind of dot that in. So wet into wet, you're just letting colors blend and mix together and fade however you want. Okay. And then this last technique is what I call wet on dry. So again, we are going to, unlike the first three, we're not going to wet the paper because we want it to be on dry paper. So just load your brush with pigment or paint, and you're just going to paint lines. Any type of like detail work, shapes and lines that you want to paint, we want to paint on dry paper. So I mainly demonstrate this technique just to show students how the difference between if I were to paint something on a wet page versus a dry page. If you want crisp, clean lines, if you don't want your colors to all kind of blend and mix and fade together, I highly recommend you paint on dry paper because if the paper is wet at all, everything will mix and blend. The other thing that I would recommend is practice doing like really thick lines where you might like press down a lot harder with the brush. And then as you let up on the pressure and gradually start to paint thinner lines, you can kind of move to like the tip of the paintbrush. And then if you want that to be brighter, as you dot that in, your paint will stay contained to just the wet areas that you just painted with those lines. Okay, so that's wet on dry. These 4 techniques are the basis or kind of the base techniques that you will use for all other techniques from here. Okay, so next technique I'm going to show you is a crayon resist. You're going to need to get a crayon, any color you want, and we are going to draw any type of lines, designs. The important thing here is to make sure that we are just focusing on lines. You don't want to color the whole entire area, but we are going to rely on the fact that the wax in the crayon is going to repel the water in the paint. So you want to press hard and make sure that that wax, you kind of build that up as bright as possible. And then just paint an even wash or a wet onto wet right on top of that. Wet the paper, load your brush with some pigment, and then as you paint over this, you should notice that that wax, okay, is going to repel the paint. Okay, so it's going to resist and repel. So you should still see those lines. The paint will cover it up if you paint over it. So if you don't like how that looks, you can always kind of use your brush, just paint on top of that and erase if you want your crayon lines to show up a little bit more prominently. But that's a crayon resist. Draw with the crayon, paint over it. Okay, the next technique I'm going to show is the salt technique. So paint any kind of wash, even wash if you want, graded wash, wet into wet. And then we are simply going to sprinkle salt on that. So with the salt technique, there are two things that you can do. You can either go ahead and while this paint is wet, sprinkle some salt on it, which I will go ahead and do. Now when we do that, the salt is going to kind of collect the water and the paint and the pigment. Okay, and it's going to, as this dries, become permanently stuck, and it's going to create these dark little speckles and crystals. The other thing that you can do, which I'll demonstrate here momentarily, is wait until your paper dries a little bit, so that instead of this being like wet paint, wait until it dries so it's just a little bit damp. When you sprinkle the salt on damp paper, it's going to create a slightly different effect. So we're waiting for that to dry. I'm going to demonstrate the plastic wrap. So with plastic wrap, I like to start with a wet into wet or an even wash. So let's go ahead and do another wet into wet since we've already done a couple even washes with the crayon resist. So you're just mixing and blending colors and pigments. Dot those in. Since I did warm colors up here for my first, let's do cool colors down here for this wet into wet. Okay. So just let all that kind of mix and blend in. And then while your paint is still wet, you're going to get a piece of plastic wrap. And you are just going to lay the plastic wrap down flat onto this area that you painted and scrunch it up. So the water that is in the paint is going to, I'll kind of put that up closer. The water's going to like stick and collect into the plastic of the plastic wrap, and it's going to create like these lighter shapes and darker areas. So once you lay this plastic wrap on, let that sit and let that dry totally. And then after your paper has totally dried, you can pull that away and it will reveal an interesting texture. So after your plastic wrap is rubbing alcohol. So with the rubbing alcohol, paint, a wash, even wash, graded wash, wet into wet, whatever you prefer. So I add that in. And I think this works best if you try to make the paint as bright as you can or as dark as you can. Okay, so once you've wet that area, go ahead and add a little bit more pigment. You never want to add so much pigment to your paper that when it dries, it looks shiny and sticky. That is too much. That is something I would try to be cautious of as you work. You never want sticky paint and shiny paint when we're working with watercolor. So I've got just a little jar here. I'm going to clean my brush really well, blot all the water out, and then you just dip your paintbrush in the rubbing alcohol. So you can either like squeeze a drop of that on there, or you can kind of draw little droplets. And what's that going to do, which you can't see super well yet, is the rubbing alcohol is going to kind of repel the water and the paint, and it will create like these lighter white little bubbles on that paint surface. So usually when you drop that on, the pigment and the paint will kind of like spread out a little bit into like a bubble-like effect. So do make sure that your paintbrush is clean. Make sure that you are working on wet or damp paper with that, or wet or damp paint. Don't let that, if I were to try to sprinkle on dry paper or dry paint, it's not going to work. Okay. So the next technique I'm going to demonstrate is going to be a lifting technique. So before I do the lifting technique, I'm going to do a wash. So similar to with the rubbing alcohol, I think this works best if you have like an even wash but with a like dark or bright pigment. This technique works with any color, but when you have lighter colors, like a really pale yellow or something similar to that, it can be a little bit more difficult to see the contrast with your effect. So kind of similar to what we wanted to do with the salt technique, where you want to let this dry a little bit so it is more damp as opposed to wet. I'm going to paint a wash, and I'm going to let that dry a little bit. So while I'm doing that, I'm going to go ahead and get another pinch of salt and kind of put that on top of this damp paper here where I already painted. So at first the salt is just going to kind of sit on the paper. It's not going to seem like it's doing much, but the longer that the salt sits on your damp paper, it's going to start to pull up and absorb the moisture that's in the paper, and you're going to get a much different look and texture to the salt crystals than if you sprinkle them on wet paper. All right, 2 more techniques. So the next one we're going to work kind of in a like a wet into wet, or not wet into wet, wet on dry type of color, and this is going to be stippling. Okay, so we with many of my classes we talk about stippling in 7th grade art as a drawing technique. So with stippling is just shading with dots, and the more dots that you stipple together, the darker your value will look, and the more you spread those dots out, the lighter that will be. So we are going to do this same technique, only with a paintbrush and paint. And one thing I like to point out to students is when you stipple a whole bunch of dots together, the water and the paint is all going to kind of mix and blend, and it's going to create almost kind of like a little like blob shape. And then as you spread those dots out, you'll start to get more individual little dots and textures with that. So we could simply do this with a single color, stipple that out. I think stippling is a really good technique to create textures in your artwork. So it's really good for doing like landscapes and getting the texture of leaves on trees and things like that. And I also think stippling looks best if you layer multiple colors. Okay, so either multiple layers of the same color to build up greater contrast between your darkest areas and your light, or if you layer a different color on top of an existing color. And as we know, as I've talked about earlier, it's better to blend and mix colors on top once those have fully had a chance to dry. Okay, so I'm going to stipple a layer of color, and I'm going to wait for that to dry a little bit. So I'm going to move on to my last technique, which is going to be the sponge technique. So for the sponge technique, I'm going to take a sponge. So I've just got like old sponges that are cut up into small pieces, and we are going to take just like the corner of this sponge, and I'm just going to dip it into one of my little ovals of pigment that's already got like some water to it. Okay, so we just want to kind of dip that in so it's a little bit wet. The other thing you could do is you could take your paintbrush and load your paintbrush with pigment and just kind of dot that in or touch that into the end of the sponge. Either will work to create the texture. Okay, and we're going to apply this in a similar way that we did with the stippling. We're just going to kind of like dot and dab that in. So the sponge technique is also a really good technique to use to get texture. So it'll create like a texture in trees, bushes, grass for a landscape, and kind of similar to what I told you before with the stippling. It often looks more interesting and better if you can layer multiple colors and multiple layers. Okay. So for the lifting technique, we've painted this even wash in here, and we're letting that dry. So lifting technique is important for two reasons. Number one, if you make a mistake and you've kind of painted an area and you don't like it, the lifting technique is almost kind of like an erasing technique with the paint, where you can kind of lift away the pigment that you've painted and kind of pull that out and create a lighter area. Another reason I think it's important for students to understand what happens like when you lift paint away is if I paint an area and then I go to paint, say, another layer or a line or a shape in this area, and I paint over it. Okay, the more that I paint over that, it's going to start to lighten. So you can already faintly see where I painted my paintbrush. Your brush is going to pull away paint and pigment from the paper. Okay, so I'm going to go through. All I've done is clean my brush out, and I've dabbed all the excess water out of the brush. And now I'm going to go right back on top of that area and using the paintbrush kind of like an eraser. If it's just a damp brush, doesn't have a lot of water in it, now when I draw on top of that, I can create kind of like cleaner lines and a little bit more contrast with that. Lifting is a really good technique if you want to create like clouds. Okay, so you can kind of paint an area in a sky and then kind of lift and pull that away and create slightly lighter shapes or darker shapes, depending on whether you pull the pigment in places. So I can kind of control that to create a little cloud effect. Or again, you can use that if you want for kind of like an erasing techniques. If you don't really like something you've painted, you can go in and like erase and erase that away. Okay, so lifting is just pulling away the paint. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to stipple in another layer of dots just so you can kind of see what it looks like when we have multiple layers of a color stippled in on top. So see how the colors will start to mix and blend together. And then I'm also going to mix in a second color right on top of my sponge. And then you can kind of see how those colors will mix and blend as well. The other thing I would experiment with on your paper, if you've got a big enough space, is what happens when you use the sponge technique and your sponge is wet versus a dry sponge. Okay, so that is all of the techniques. Before I finish the video, I'm going to pause this. I'm going to dry my paper and make sure all this paint is dry, and then I'm going to demonstrate how to carefully peel away the tape and see how to create your nice clean lines with the masking with tape effect. Okay, so I just stepped away and paused my video for a second to use a hair dryer to speed up the drying process on this so I could quickly show you the end result. Now, I don't recommend you do this unless you're just really pressed for time, because I will say that some of the techniques, because we sped the process up, they didn't really work as effectively as we'd like. So my recommendation is going to be, if you paint this, let your painting dry overnight before you decide to pull your tape or pull your plastic wrap off. But the final thing that we will do now that we've got that is we're going to carefully pull our tape. So you do want your paint to be completely dry. And when you do pull the tape, rather than completely like lifting and pulling up, recommend that you pull at a slight angle, almost like perpendicular, and pull very, very slowly to reveal your clean lines. Okay, so I'm going to pull all of this tape. I'm going to pause to do the rest, and then I'm going to do a final recap and review so that you can make sure you totally understand how to do all of the techniques. So I pulled the tape off my entire painting, including along the edges. So this is what the finished painting looks like. So just a quick recap and review. We did an even wash with the paper. Put an even solid layer of color so it all looks uniform and consistent. Here we've got a graded wash. Wet the paper, put a stripe of color on one side, and use your paintbrush to gradually fade that color away into the white. Second type of graded wash. Wet the paper, add a stripe of one color on one side, a stripe of color on a different side, and gradually blend and mix the two so one fades all the way into the other. Oh, wet into wet, wet the paper, and then just allow the wet paint to mix and blend and bleed together and create an interesting texture and effect. We've got a wet into dry up here. This is where you can paint clean lines and details, but you're just painting with wet paint on dry paper. With the crayon resist, draw with the crayon any kind of lines, designs, patterns, and paint around it with any kind of even wash, graded wash, wet into wet, whatever you prefer, and you allow the wax and the crayons to repel the water and the paint. With the salt we've got up here, um, paint a layer of paint and either sprinkle your salt on the wet paint if you want a more textured and kind of darker looking speckles on that. If you apply your salt to damp paper, you'll get much lighter looking, subtle looking speckles on the page. Plastic wrap, wet paint, either a wet into wet or a wash of sorts. Lay plastic on top of it, scrunch it up, and allow that to dry. Once it dries, peel the plastic wrap off. For rubbing alcohol, which this one didn't work as successfully as I would like, but you apply your paint and using a paintbrush, drop the rubbing alcohol on top of wet paint, and it will kind of spread that out and create lighter, almost bubble looking effect in the paint. For the sponge technique, use a sponge, dip it in your pigment, and dab that on. For the lifting technique, you're going to paint a wash, and then once the paper is damp, use your paintbrush to lift away or erase away your pigment. For your stippling, you just use a brush and paint and kind of dot that in. For the sponge technique and the stippling, remember the technique can sometimes be more effective and more interesting if you layer multiple colors. And then finally, for your masking with tape, make sure that you have a dry paper, tape out a design, paint around the whole thing, and then after it dries, peel off your tape. Okay. So those are all of the techniques that I demonstrated in class. If you have any questions, please feel that you ask for help or assistance as you are doing those.